In the burning sands of the North African desert, there was one name that made the Allies hesitate every time the front lines shifted. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. The man who turned tanks into lightning-strike weapons, turned scorching sand into an advantage, and turned himself into a nightmare for seasoned British and American officers. He didn't need overwhelming numbers, nor endless supplies. With speed, instinct, and audacity alone, Rommel could push an entire division back to the edge of the horizon. Churchill himself once admitted, "Rommel is a great general." But behind the victories were irrational orders, betrayal lurking in the dark, and a death that has never been told truthfully. This is not just the story of a military genius, but the tragedy of a soldier trapped between ideals and a ruthless political machine. Rommel, the man the world still speaks of, even as he rests in silence. Erwin Rommel was one of the most famous German field marshals of World War II, known as the Desert Fox for his skillful maneuvering on the North African battlefield. He was regarded as a master of military cunning and a courageous, chivalrous commander, respected by both allies and adversaries. Although he served under Hitler, Rommel was not a member of the Nazi Party. Immediately after the war, Western perspectives, especially in the United States, continued to praise Rommel as a talented yet relatively humane military leader. Rommel was born on the 15th of November 1891 in Heidenheim, Württemberg, Germany. His father was the principal of a secondary school, but wished for his son to pursue a military career. So in 1910, Rommel joined the German army and trained at the Danzig Officer School. During World War I, he quickly proved his talent. With only 150 soldiers, Lieutenant Rommel pushed back 7,000 Italian troops on the Italian front, earning Germany's Iron Cross. His bravery became so well known that comrades often said, "Where Rommel is, that is the front line." After the war, Rommel rose to captain, then battalion commander, and was assigned as an instructor at the Dresden Military Academy. In the interwar period, he became famous for his book Infantry Attacks, which impressed Hitler. In 1937, Hitler appointed Rommel as a liaison officer to the Hitler Youth Academy. By late 1938, Rommel was given command of the Führer Escort Battalion, Hitler's personal guard unit. In 1939, Hitler promoted him to the rank of Major General and placed him under the Führer's direct command. When the war broke out, Rommel was assigned to command the 7th Panzer Division, Division Gespenster, the Ghost Division of the Wehrmacht. In May 1940, during the campaign to conquer France, he and the Ghost Division advanced at remarkable speed through Belgium and into France. He personally directed tank units to cross the Meuse River under enemy fire, and even crossed the river himself in a small boat to survey the battlefield. With exceptional mobility, Rommel's division advanced to the port of Cherbourg and the shores of the English Channel within just a few weeks of the campaign. In the Battle of Arras, the 21st of May, 1940, he even ordered the use of 88mm anti-aircraft guns to destroy British tanks, an unexpected tactic that made Arras one of his boldest attacks of 1,940. These achievements earned admiration from both enemies and allies. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill later stated, "We are facing a daring and skillful opponent. Rommel is indeed a great general." After the French campaign, Rommel was promoted to lieutenant general and continued to enjoy high confidence within the German forces. At the beginning of 1941, the situation in North Africa tilted decisively in favor of the Allied forces. After Italy's disastrous failure in its campaign to seize Egypt, its troops were hit hard by the British counteroffensive in Operation Compass. Within just a few months, nearly 130,000 Italian soldiers were captured in Libya and Egypt. Faced with the threat of losing the entire North African front, a region crucial for controlling the Suez Canal and the Middle Eastern oil supply routes, Hitler was forced to intervene. Hitler's solution was to send a young, bold general, someone not yet constrained by the conservative military establishment, into the battlefield, Erwin Rommel. In February 1941, Rommel was given command of a special unit known as the Afrika Korps, the German Afrika Korps. In theory, he was only meant to support the weakened Italian forces, but in reality, as soon as he set foot in Tripoli, Rommel quickly took control of the front and assumed operational command of the campaign. Instead of following the directive to hold the defensive line, He took the initiative and launched a rapid counteroffensive striking directly at British positions in Cyrenaica, eastern Libya. This counteroffensive, codenamed Operation Sonnenblume, caught both the Allied High Command and the German General Staff by surprise. In just a few short weeks, Rommel had completely altered the situation on the North African front. Beginning in early March 1941, units of the Afrika Korps simultaneously launched a counteroffensive. The highly mobile German armored spearheads repeatedly drove deep into weak points in the British defensive line, striking hard at both flanks and cutting off the enemy's retreat. Each attack lasted only a few hours, yet it was enough to break the British defenses apart piece by piece. The British and Commonwealth forces, having only recently captured territory from the Italians and unable to consolidate their positions in time, were immediately forced into a purely defensive and reactive posture. Along the coastal road near Benghazi, retreating convoys stretched out under the scorching sun and swirling dust. Many units became trapped as vehicles caught fire, ran out of fuel, or were cut off when German forces surged ahead. Rommel gave the enemy no opportunity to regroup. He constantly changed the direction of attack, used decoy units to mislead the British, and then suddenly unleashed his main spearheads in the opposite direction. By early April 1941, the British were forced to retreat deep toward the Egyptian border. It was a victory far beyond all expectations. Neither the Germans nor the British had anticipated that Rommel's counteroffensive would be so rapid and far-reaching. The Imperial War Museums noted, Rommel attacked immediately, driving back the already weakened British Imperial forces all the way to the Egyptian border. His advance was halted only at Tobruk, a heavily fortified port due to supply shortages. Always to Wud. Tobruk became the only remaining stronghold of the British forces. For months, Rommel carried out cycles of encirclement, assault, and withdrawal due to shortages of ammunition and fuel. However, it was precisely this series of bold counterattacks that made his name known across Europe. From that point on, both German and British newspapers began referring to him as the Desert Fox. Throughout 1941 and the first half of 1942, Rommel continued to apply the Blitzkrieg doctrine lightning war, but in his own way adapted to the desert terrain. Instead of fixed front lines, he used small, flexible formations, concentrating tanks into powerful spearheads, constantly shifting direction to strike at the enemy's weakest points, then swiftly swinging around the flanks to drive straight into their rear. The North African desert, seemingly endless and barren, turned out to be the ideal setting for high-speed warfare. At Gazala in May 1942, Rommel unexpectedly committed his entire force to attack from a direction the British believed was impossible to traverse. The enemy was split apart, with individual units isolated and destroyed, one after another. Within just a few days, the British defensive line collapsed, opening a clear path for German forces to advance straight toward Tobruk. On the 21st of June, 1942, Tobruk fell. The fortress that had forced the Germans to halt a year earlier was now in Rommel's hands. More than 30,000 British and Commonwealth soldiers were taken prisoner, and hundreds of tanks, along with massive quantities of supplies, fell into German hands. This victory not only elevated Rommel's standing in Hitler's eyes, but also drew the attention of the entire world to the commander known as the Desert Fox, the man who turned the harsh desert into the most mobile and unpredictable battlefield of World War II. Despite achieving a series of stunning victories in the desert, Rommel soon faced a fundamental problem he could not solve on his own: logistics. His entire Afrika Korps depended almost entirely on supply shipments from Europe, transported across the Mediterranean. However, the British Navy, holding superiority thanks to its control of Malta, a stronghold often described as a stationary aircraft carrier in the heart of the Mediterranean, constantly attacked German and Italian supply convoys. Ammunition, fuel, food, everything was in critically short supply. In contrast, the Allies were receiving increasingly strong reinforcements, especially after the United States officially entered the war at the end of 1941. In 1942, as the North African front entered its decisive phase, the balance of power began to shift noticeably. In the early weeks of the year, reports from the front indicated that Axis forces were weakening rapidly. Fuel was scarce, spare parts were running out, and mechanized units were suffering continuous losses after many months of maneuvering in the desert. Meanwhile, the British were growing stronger. The British government decided to play its strategic card. Bernard Montgomery, was appointed to command the Eighth Army. As soon as he arrived in Egypt, Montgomery immediately reorganized the entire force. He reinforced defensive positions, consolidated scattered units into disciplined formations, removed ineffective officers, and raised training intensity to the highest level. At the same time, American aid poured in. Sherman tanks lined up in long rows at forward depots. Field artillery was deployed continuously. Fighter aircraft began to gain control of the skies, and supply convoys moved day and night along the Alexandria-El-Alamein axis. By October 1942, all of Montgomery's preparations were complete. At dawn, on the opening day of the El Alamein offensive, British artillery simultaneously opened fire. Explosions rippled across the desert, destroying layer after layer of obstacles that the Axis forces had spent months constructing. After the initial barrage, British tanks and infantry advanced in waves, breaking into key German-Italian defensive positions. Minefields, barbed wire fences, and gun emplacements were smashed apart section by section. For nearly 2 weeks, the battlefield remained in a state of constant combat. The Afrika Korps could no longer maintain its usual rhythm of counterattacks. Every time Rommel sent tanks forward to plug a gap, British aircraft immediately carried out airstrikes. Every time the Germans attempted a counterblow, the supply columns failed to arrive in time. Reports sent from the front to Rommel's headquarters repeated the same phrases over and over: fuel shortage, ammunition shortage, tanks disabled, no air support available. Rommel, despite holding the rank of field marshal, could do little more than react. He had to pull back regiments one by one, gathering his mobile forces to the rear to avoid having his formations split in two. But Montgomery was always one step ahead. Each time the Axis troops withdrew, the British immediately expanded their offensive thrusts, pressing the front while breaking German-Italian units into scattered, isolated groups. By the 4th of November, 1942, the last defensive lines had been broken. The route of retreat to the west was completely exposed. Rommel was forced to order a full withdrawal, even though Hitler had issued a directive that not one step back was allowed. Had he not retreated, the entire Afrika Korps would have been annihilated on the spot. But the next decisive blow came even faster. Only 4 days later, on the 8th of November 1942, American and British forces simultaneously landed in Morocco and Algeria in Operation Torch. Tens of thousands of Allied troops opened a new front from the west, leaving Rommel trapped between two pincers. Montgomery pushing down from El Alamein, and the American-British landing forces advancing from Morocco and Algeria. From late November to early 1943, Rommel was forced to withdraw his forces in groups across Libya toward Tunisia. The retreat, stretching over hundreds of kilometers, was continually harassed by Allied aircraft. Any unit that fell behind was immediately left behind. On the operational maps, the territory controlled by the Axis shrank day by day. By March 1943, when the situation could no longer be salvaged, Rommel was ordered to return to Germany under the pretext of medical leave. In reality, it was a way to remove him from a front that could no longer be saved. 1 month later, all remaining Axis forces in North Africa surrendered. After leaving the desert, Rommel was not immediately returned to the battlefield. Instead, he was assigned a new mission: to organize the defensive system along the Western European coastline, the very place everyone knew would become the main landing point for the Allied forces. From late 1943, Hitler appointed him Commander-in-Chief of Army Group B, responsible for the entire defensive zone in western France, stretching from the Netherlands down to southern France. Among these areas, Normandy was one of the key links in the large-scale defensive system known as the Atlantic Wall. This was the network of fortifications Hitler ordered to be constructed to counter the threat of a seaborne invasion. Something everyone knew would happen, though no one knew when or where. As soon as he assumed the position, Rommel began inspecting the entire coastline. With his battlefield experience, he quickly realized that the defensive system had been greatly overestimated. Gun emplacements lacked proper protection, mines were sparsely laid, fortifications lacked depth, and most importantly, the mobile units reacted too slowly. Rommel believed that once the Allies successfully landed on the shore, the chances of pushing them back into the sea would be almost zero because they would hold overwhelming superiority in air power and logistics. Therefore, Rommel advocated for a stop them at the water's edge strategy, meaning the Allied forces had to be blocked the moment they set foot on the beach. He pushed for the construction of anti-tank obstacles, the dense laying of mines, the building of additional bunkers, and the positioning of artillery so that it could create crossfire over the landing zones. But during this very period, the conflict between Rommel and the High Command in Berlin grew increasingly severe. Hitler and his close generals maintained a conservative stance. They believed the main Allied landing would occur at Pas de Calais, the point closest to Britain, and therefore concentrated most of their forces and heavy artillery there. At the same time, Hitler issued a no-retreat order, forcing defensive units to hold their positions and wait for instructions from the highest command. Rommel strongly opposed this. He argued that rigidly maintaining fixed positions would turn German troops into easy targets for Allied naval guns and bombers. But all of his proposals were dismissed. On the morning of the 6th of June, 1944, when the first Allied transport ships approached the Normandy coast and launched Operation Overlord, Rommel was not at his headquarters. He was in Germany on a short leave to celebrate his wife's birthday, after months of intense pressure overseeing the coastal defenses. Early warning signals about the invasion had been delayed due to bad weather, which caused German radar, communications, and reconnaissance to operate unreliably. At the same time, Allied deception operations, including dummy formations, decoy aircraft, and false intelligence led the German High Command to believe that the main landing would take place at Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. When the official reports finally reached Berlin, the headquarters described a chaotic front line. Allied warships were bombarding defensive positions, engineering units had begun clearing obstacles on the beaches, and the first waves of troops were advancing through smoke and dust. Rommel immediately returned to the front as fast as possible, but he did not arrive in the operational area until late afternoon, by which time the Allied beachheads had already been established and were continuing to expand. At the beaches, the fortifications Rommel had spent months preparing were effective only in the initial phase. Some German machine gun nests and anti-tank guns fought fiercely, inflicting heavy casualties on the first waves of the landings. But the Allies' overwhelming naval and air superiority soon changed the entire situation. Naval gunfire pounded the positions relentlessly, destroying or isolating many bunkers and gun emplacements. German troops barely had time to return fire before being hit again by low-flying Allied aircraft, delivering repeated bombing runs. By the end of the day, tens of thousands of Allied troops had reached the shore, established temporary defensive lines, and brought additional tanks and artillery ashore from the landing craft. Rommel's stop-them-at-the-water's-edge plan had officially failed, not because it was ineffective, but because he lacked the authority to deploy armored forces as he saw fit, and did not have an air force strong enough to resist the assault. By the time he returned, everything had already gone far beyond what any individual, even a field marshal, could control. In the weeks that followed, Rommel continued trying to manage the situation. He moved constantly through the contested areas, Caen, Bayeux, Falaise, to assess conditions, coordinate the units still fighting, and attempt to reconnect defensive lines that had been torn apart. Each day, the operational maps showed yet another area gained by the Allies. The German Air Force was almost entirely driven from the skies, leaving the ground troops in a constant state of vulnerability to sudden airstrikes. On the 17th of July, 1944, while Rommel was traveling along a road near the front to assess the situation, a group of British fighter aircraft suddenly appeared in the distance. They dived down on a cross-angle approach and strafed the slow-moving German convoy on the narrow dirt road. A burst of bullets struck the windshield of Rommel's car, causing it to lose control and veer off the road. The violent rollover threw him out of the vehicle, inflicting severe head and facial injuries. This incident forced Rommel to leave the battlefield in critical condition, and effectively marked the end of his final days, directly commanding the defense against the largest amphibious invasion of World War II. He was brought back to Germany for treatment, remaining in a coma for several days. Nazi German propaganda announced that Field Marshal Rommel had been wounded due to heroic action at the front. But in reality, the accident left him unable to continue commanding the Normandy front, and marked a fateful turning point that gradually pulled him away from Hitler's orbit, both militarily and politically. After being severely wounded in the airstrike on the 17th of July, 1944, Rommel was brought back to Germany for treatment in critical condition. During his absence, the situation in Normandy continued to deteriorate. The Allies gradually broke through the defensive lines, liberated Paris at the end of August, and pushed German forces deep into French territory. Witnessing the German army's successive defeats, Rommel, once absolutely loyal, began to lose faith in Hitler. According to many historical sources, especially from the West, He grew increasingly doubtful of the Führer's leadership, and even criticized the irrational no-retreat orders issued from Berlin. Some accounts suggest that Rommel even considered negotiating a ceasefire with the Western Allies in an attempt to save Germany from total collapse, an idea regarded as outright treason in the eyes of the Nazi regime. Amidst this turmoil, on the 20th of July 1944, a group of German officers carried out a plot to assassinate Hitler with a bomb at the Wolf's Lair headquarters in Rastenburg. The attempt failed. Hitler was only lightly injured. The aftermath was a nationwide purge. Hundreds were arrested, tortured, and executed. Although he did not participate directly, Rommel quickly fell under suspicion because of his personal connections with several officers involved in the plot, including General Claus von Stauffenberg. Notably, a few days after the assassination attempt, Rommel sent a vague message to Berlin, in which he said, "Put your trust in me." To Hitler, this was a dangerous signal. Rommel held enormous prestige within the army, especially among the soldiers on the Western Front. If he were to declare opposition to the regime, many units might follow him, something Hitler could not afford at a time when Allied forces were closing in on Germany's borders. In October 1944, while Rommel was recovering from his injuries at his home in Ulm, an SS delegation arrived at his door. They carried an ultimatum from Berlin. Either he was to commit suicide immediately, and his family would retain its honor, or he would face a military court on charges of treason, meet a humiliating death, and leave his family to suffer persecution. Rommel understood the power game of the regime all too well. He chose the quietest path. On the 14th of October 1944, Rommel put on his full military uniform and got into a car with 2 SS officers. Just a few minutes later, he swallowed a cyanide capsule in a small forest near his home. He died in silence. No trial, no sentence, no resistance. That very afternoon, German radio announced, "Field Marshal Erwin Rommel has passed away due to unrecoverable combat wounds." Nazi propaganda quickly organized a state funeral with full honors, flags, and public mourning as if he had died for the fatherland. This deception was not only meant to protect Hitler's image, but also to preserve the Rommel myth in the eyes of the German public and military. For although Hitler was willing to eliminate him in silence, the regime understood that the name Desert Fox was a symbol not easily erased. Rommel's legacy in the United States and the Western world is deeply contradictory. In the eyes of many Allied generals and veterans, Rommel was not only a dangerous opponent, but also a man worthy of respect. They called him the Knight of the Desert, an unofficial title, yet one that reflected their admiration for his courage and for his clean conduct in a war marked by brutality. Rommel was renowned for always being present at the front lines, standing side by side with his soldiers, personally surveying the battlefield, and giving orders under fire rather than commanding from the rear like many other generals. Sources such as Warfare History Network describe him as a 100% soldier, a commander willing to share danger with his men, not merely someone who issued commands. This closeness earned him absolute respect from the German troops under his command, and it was also the reason why even his enemies held an unusual degree of admiration for him. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man who rarely praised his opponents, once told Parliament, "We are opposed by one of the most formidable generals of Germany." Coming from the leader of Britain during wartime, that statement alone confirmed the military stature Rommel had achieved, even in the eyes of his enemies. Even after the war ended, when Nazi Germany had become a symbol of atrocity, Rommel, with his unusually principled conduct in modern warfare, still retained a distinct position. In the West, he was often separated from the collective image of the Nazi regime. Not being accused of war crimes and having no involvement in genocide, Rommel was regarded by many as a professional soldier, rather than a Nazi general in the negative sense. For that reason, in the minds of Americans and Westerners, Rommel became a rare exception. A general of the enemy who was still studied, analyzed, and even respected, a reminder that in war, there are individuals who manage to preserve their dignity amid bullets, bombs, and hatred. However, there is also much debate regarding Rommel's character and political stance. Some historians refer to this as the Rommel myth, the image of him as an open-minded, gentle German general untainted by political motives was shaped largely by the Allies, while in reality, his views on Nazism remain ambiguous. According to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum, Some argue that Rommel fully supported fascism, while others claim he acted out of obedience or political naivete. In terms of his personal background, Rommel received special favor from Hitler. He was highly trusted. In 1937, the army assigned him to lead the Hitler Youth, and in 1940, Hitler personally promoted him to command the elite 7th Panzer Division. Yet most sources also note that Rommel neither witnessed nor ordered the brutal crimes of the regime. His Afrika Korps was never accused of committing war crimes. Erwin Rommel won and lost on the battlefield, but he left an indelible mark. He is often described as a tactical genius, bold, decisive, and skilled at exploiting terrain and surprise to outperform the enemy. Yet the final decisions made above him, and the severe logistical limitations also played a significant role in his defeat in North Africa. On one hand, Rommel is seen as a model of the dedicated soldier, a knight in war, admired by Americans. On the other hand, his close association with Hitler's regime and his role within the German war machine have made his image a persistent subject of controversy. Churchill later wrote that although Rommel was a loyal German soldier, he had grown to dislike Hitler and paid with his life for being involved in the plot to save Germany from the dictator's grip. Churchill also described Rommel's chivalrous spirit as something rare in modern warfare. Thus, for American audiences today, Rommel's story carries a dual tone, one of admiration for his strategic brilliance, and another of moral questioning. How does one evaluate a highly skilled general, a man who won many battles, yet ultimately fought for a criminal regime? It is precisely this combination of outstanding military achievements and lingering doubts about his political commitments that has made Rommel an intriguing and much debated historical figure.